Night cloaked the Korean coast in an impenetrable darkness, broken only by the rhythmic rumble of waves. In this profound silence, like a colossal ghost, lay the American battleship USS Wisconsin, a steel leviathan almost 300 meters long, armed with 9 powerful 406mm guns. This ship, a legend of the seas, was considered absolutely invulnerable, a true floating fortress capable of obliterating an entire city with a few devastating salvos. It had honorably endured all the trials of World War II, relentlessly pounding Japanese fortifications and even surviving a deadly typhoon that sank dozens of ships, always returning without a single serious scratch. However, this time, the battleship was being watched by different eyes, the eyes of a fearless enemy. North Korea, daring to commit an unprecedented act of defiance, planned to attack this very deadliest and most fortified war machine of its time. For the Americans, it was a genuine shock. They were accustomed to believing that such a giant could approach any coast with impunity, and enemies would flee at the mere sight of its silhouette. But on Korean soil, there were people who knew no fear. Their batteries, skillfully hidden in the rocks, awaited a moment that would forever enter history to strike at America's most invincible battleship. In this decisive moment, it would become clear whether Big Wisky was truly invulnerable, or if it was merely a myth about to be shattered by fire and iron. To fully grasp the shock of the attack on Big Wisky, one must understand that this battleship was not just a ship, but a living embodiment of the very idea of invincibility. When the United States developed the Iowa-class battleships, their goal was to create a steel fist that would not only terrorize the seas, but also serve as a shining symbol of American supremacy. Engineers dreamed of a truly impossible combination: the speed of a light cruiser, the armor of a medieval fortress, and firepower comparable to a battery of siege guns capable of leveling a city. The USS Wisconsin, the third in this line of Titans, was dubbed an engineering marvel from the very beginning. Its 9 monstrous 406mm guns could fire up to 30 kilometers, with each shell weighing almost a ton, enough to turn a reinforced concrete bunker into a pile of dust. When all 3 turrets fired simultaneously, the ground on the coast literally shook, and enemy fortifications vanished in clouds of smoke and flame. It was not just a weapon, but a true force of nature, encased in steel walls. But the battleship's power was not limited to its artillery. Its side armor, over 30 centimeters thick, transformed the ship into an impregnable fortress that ordinary shells could not penetrate. Dozens of rapid-fire medium-caliber cannons and batteries of anti-aircraft guns created a fiery dome around the battleship, through which no aircraft could pass alive. At the same time, its speed of 55 kilometers per hour made it incredibly maneuverable for such a behemoth. It was nicknamed the Runner in knight's armor. Every sailor who stepped onto Big Wisky's deck felt part of something greater than just a fleet. This battleship instilled terror in enemies even before its silhouette appeared on the horizon. It was a symbol of intimidation, an embodiment of iron will and unwavering resolve. Everyone considered it unsinkable, and that is why, when North Korea dared to challenge this giant, the world held its breath, wondering if it was an act of madness or desperate courage. When a USS Wisconsin first put to sea, the world was engulfed in the flames of World War II. The Pacific Ocean raged with a deadly struggle against Japan, and there was no place for the weak. From its very first days, Big Wisky found itself in the thick of the action. Its steel sides cut through the waves, and its guns prepared to demonstrate American power in its ultimate expression. The Philippine campaign became its first serious test. In December 1944, the Wisconsin supported American landings, unleashing a barrage of fire on Japanese fortifications. Imagine, on the coast of Manila, Japanese pillboxes and bunkers were lined up. Hundreds of soldiers prepared to repel an attack, and at that moment, a roar echoed from the horizon, and 9 monstrous guns opened fire. Each shell crashed into the ground with the force of an earthquake, explosions raising clouds of dust and smoke. Concrete walls shattered, and with them, resistance crumbled. In a matter of minutes, a defense designed for weeks of battle vanished into oblivion. Then came the attacks on Tokyo. In February 1945, at dawn, while Japanese bases still slumbered, Big Wisky approached the coast alongside aircraft carriers and destroyers. American fighters howled in the sky, and shells flew from the battleship's deck. The force of their strikes was such that runways and hangars disappeared from the map in mere minutes. In a few days, the Japanese lost hundreds of aircraft, and this marked the beginning of the end of their air superiority. But the most terrible enemy was not Japan, but nature itself. December 1944 went down in history as the month of Typhoon Cobra. Winds tore off masts, waves flipped destroyers like toys. 3 American ships sank along with hundreds of sailors. The water boiled as if in hell, metal bent under the force of the elements. And amidst this horror, the USS Wisconsin held its course. Its captain and crew fought for every minute. Waves crashed against the hull, but the steel giant did not flinch. It passed through the typhoon as if through fire, emerging without any serious damage. From that day on, the battleship's nickname, the unsinkable giant, was firmly established in the fleet. Soon came a moment that would forever enter history. February 19th, 1945, off the island of Iwo Jima. Thousands of Marines prepared to land on an island that the Japanese had turned into an impregnable fortress. Hundreds of guns were aimed at the shore from deeply camouflaged underground bunkers. However, before the soldiers stepped onto the black sand, Big Wisky opened fire. Its shells rained down on Japanese positions, destroying bunkers, crumbling rocks, and tearing the earth to shreds. Each explosion brought victory closer and gave the landing party a chance to survive. Marines later recalled, "If it weren't for the Wisconsin salvos, we wouldn't have advanced even 100 meters." Then came Okinawa, the last and bloodiest battle. The battleship was again at the forefront, crushing Japanese fortifications, destroying artillery batteries, and severing supply lines. Where the enemy tried to hold on, the earth turned into a sea of fire. And all this time, Big Wisky remained undefeated. It survived the war, withstood storms, and overcame all the challenges thrown at it by the enemy. By this point, it had become not just a ship, but a true legend, a steel storm spoken of even by its adversaries. But ahead awaited a new role and a new, far more cunning and dangerous enemy. When the Wisconsin's guns fell silent after Japan's surrender, it seemed its mission was complete. The world celebrated the end of the war. Soldiers returned home, and the giant battleship, having survived storms and battles, could finally rest. However, even in those peaceful days, it was not idle. Its holds, recently packed with shells, now carried thousands of American soldiers returning from the Pacific. This was Operation Magic Carpet. The huge warship, built for destruction, suddenly became a means of hope. Sailors, officers, privates, they all boarded its deck, knowing Big Wisky was taking them home. For many, it was the first real moment of relief in long years of war. But the calm did not last long. The world was again on the brink. A new point of tension appeared on the map: Korea. In 1950, North Korea, supported by its allies, launched an offensive, and the entire peninsula was engulfed in the flames of war. The Americans needed a force that could not just be present, but dominate the battlefield. And so, the Wisconsin was brought back into service. It docked in Philadelphia, underwent a rapid update, and came back to life. Its metal sides rang out. A new batch of shells was loaded into the turrets. Fresh crews boarded the deck. The sailors knew this would not be a pleasure cruise. Ahead lay a war where the enemy would not play by the usual rules. North Korea had well-hidden batteries, cunning tunnels, and was ready to fight to the last. When Big Wisky went to sea, it was greeted like a hero returning from legend. In Japan, it became the flagship of the American 7th Fleet, replacing its sister ship, the USS New Jersey. Its appearance in the Pacific once again struck fear into enemies. Where the silhouette of this giant appeared on the horizon, one thing was known. Soon the Earth would speak with iron and fire. And so it happened. In November 1951, the Wisconsin arrived off the Korean coast and immediately made its presence known. Its salvos illuminated the night sky as it rained fire on North Korean positions. In one swoop, it could turn a fortified height into a smoking crater. And soon, it was spoken of again. This was a ship that knew no mercy, that returned to battle after years, tearing the enemy apart with its former fury. And it was here in Korea that a new chapter of its history began, a story where legend collided with a real threat, a story in which, for the first time in many years, Big Wisky felt the enemy's blow. When the USS Wisconsin entered the waters of the Korean peninsula, the war was already raging. Northern forces were pressing the south. Front lines were burning, and American command desperately needed a weapon of intimidation that could, by its mere presence, shift the balance of power. And so, in November 1951, its gigantic shadow rose over the horizon. For the soldiers on shore, it was a vision, as if a steel fortress itself had emerged from legend to unleash its wrath upon the enemy. The first mission was simple and ruthless: artillery support for ground troops. The North Koreans occupied fortified positions. Their bunkers were deeply dug into the ground, and their pillboxes were built to withstand massive attacks. But they had not factored in Big Wisky, now facing them. At night, when the front quieted, its guns began their song. First came the roar of illuminating shells, and the entire front line lit up as if morning had arrived. Then followed a main-caliber salvo, and the enemy vanished in a fiery storm. Soldiers on shore recalled that the ground trembled beneath their feet, and enemy batteries turned into piles of ash in a matter of seconds. One night, near Kaesong, was particularly memorable. A South Korean unit found itself surrounded. The North Koreans were preparing for a final assault. At that moment, Big Wisky came to the rescue. First, 3 illuminating shells cut through the darkness, and the battlefield erupted in white light, as if the sun had risen at midnight, and then 9 monstrous barrels simultaneously spat out their shells. In a matter of minutes, the North Korean attack disintegrated, bunkers turned to ruins, and survivors fled. Those who survived later confessed that it felt like the end of the world. After that, Big Wisky became not just a weapon, it became a savior. Wherever it appeared, troops knew the enemy would not stand. Its fires suppressed coastal batteries, destroyed ammunition depots, and broke railway lines carrying reinforcements. Every appearance of the battleship on the horizon for the North Koreans meant disaster. But it was precisely such actions that led to the inevitable. The enemy began to seek a way to respond. And soon came the moment when North Korean batteries dared to take a crazy step to attack the deadliest naval machine of its time. They knew they might perish, but they wanted to prove that even a colossus was not immune to a blow. And this marked the beginning of that legendary episode when Big Wisky, for the first time in decades, felt the heat of an enemy strike. At night, the sea turns into an abyss, where even the strongest ship seems like a small in the darkness. But when the USS Wisconsin rose on the horizon, night ceased to be the enemy's ally. Its crew had perfected a special tactic that became legendary. The battleship fired illuminating shells, and in an instant, the darkness over the battlefield turned into dazzling day. For surrounded units, it was salvation. For enemies, the beginning of a nightmare. In January 1952, an episode occurred that soldiers would talk about for a long time. A South Korean battalion found itself trapped in a lowland, surrounded by superior North Korean forces. Night was falling. Enemy forces were preparing to strike from 3 sides, and it seemed the outcome of the battle was predetermined. But then a concise command came over the air: Big Wisky on station. Moments later, 3 fireballs erupted in the sky, illuminating the battlefield with bright light, as if powerful searchlights had turned on, and then 9 colossal barrels spoke in unison. 406mm shells exploded the earth, sweeping everything in their path. The North Korean attackers didn't even have time to launch their assault. Their positions simply disappeared under a hail of steel. This was not the only such incident. Near Wonsan, the North Koreans attempted to break through defenses using hidden trenches and fortified firing points. However, as soon as they began to move, the Wisconsin intervened. Its salvos not only destroyed the cover, they literally plowed the earth, turning trenches into a ditch of smoking clay and debris. Sailors later recounted that in such moments, the ship seemed to come alive, growing fiercer with each new series of salvos. The enemy was learning. The North Koreans understood that the front could not be held as long as this steel giant stood at sea. They began to look for its weaknesses. Artillery batteries were camouflaged in the rocks. Disguised railway guns changed positions after each salvo. They realized that a direct hit on Big Wisky was almost suicide, but it could be a blow to the legend, a symbolic challenge that would show the vulnerability of even such titans. And so, in March of that same year, the moment of truth arrived. The Wisconsin was tasked with destroying a strategic railway tunnel through which the North Koreans were moving reinforcements and weapons. The ship approached the coast, its guns aimed at the rocks. Salvo after salvo pounded the tunnel entrance, tearing apart trains and wagons inside. At that moment, everything looked familiar. Another operation, another victory. But the enemy had already prepared its trap. A hidden battery on shore remained silent, waiting. And when the giant fired at the tunnel, flames erupted from its barrels. Shells sped towards the sea, and one of them hit its target precisely. For the first time in decades, Big Wisky took a hit. The roar of the explosion pierced the silence, as if the sea itself trembled. A North Korean shell, fired from deep within the rocks, struck the Wisconsin directly. The metal shuddered, sparks flew above the deck, pieces of plating tore away. It was a blow no one on the ship expected. The legendary Big Wisky, having survived World War II and Typhoon Cobra, felt the fangs of the enemy for the first time in many years. The hit occurred on the starboard side, where a 40mm anti-aircraft mount stood. In an instant, hell broke loose around it. Shrapnel pierced the deck, several sailors fell, hit by flying metal. Fortunately, casualties were avoided. 3 were wounded. But the very fact of being hit hung over the crew like a cold blow to the heart. People realized, we are not invulnerable, they can reach us. For a few seconds, the ship froze, the explosion deafening many. Ears rang, smoke enveloped the deck. But it is in such moments that the true character of sailors is revealed. While some extinguished fires, others rushed to the wounded, and the main gun crews were already awaiting orders. There was no panic in the eyes of the crew. There was fury. No one could forgive the enemy for daring to lay a hand on Big Wisky. The captain did not hesitate. His voice sounded short and sharp over the PA system. Train guns. Target battery. And at that very second, the main caliber turrets began to turn. 9 monstrous barrels turned towards the coast, towards where the deadly challenge had come from. At that moment, the entire crew understood that the response would be such that the earth would shake. From the sea, hundreds of eyes watched the shore. People held their breath. No one doubted that retribution was about to occur. The legend, struck for the first time, prepared to deliver a response that would go down in history. On the nearby destroyer, the USS Duncan, sailors also witnessed this moment. They saw the steel giant feel pain, and they knew the response would be more terrible than anyone could imagine. The radio crackled with a short message, half joke, half warning, temper, temper. Okay, calm down, calm down. But everyone understood that there would be no more calm. At that moment, Big Wisky seemed to come alive. All its steel, all its mechanisms, all its thousands of tons of metal transformed into a single organism that breathed with a thirst for revenge. And when the first barrel fired a salvo, it became clear. Hell awaited the shore. The main caliber salvo sounded as if the sky itself had split apart. 9 monstrous barrels simultaneously spat out shells, weighing almost a ton each towards the shore. In the blink of an eye, they turned the night sky into a red-hot corridor of death. A second later, the earth trembled, rocks shattered, And where the North Korean battery had recently been hiding, a fiery mushroom cloud rose, as if it were a volcanic eruption. But that was only the first blow. Big Wisky did not stop. The turrets reloaded, and a moment later, a second wave of shells headed for the shore. The impacts landed in a dense carpet, sweeping away everything, living and inanimate. The coastal battery disappeared completely. Its position turned into a crater, smoking with fire and metal. Huts, trees, even the rocks themselves were pulverized. Where enemy positions had been a second ago, a red-hot wasteland now stretched. The powerful shockwave reached the sea, hitting the hull of the Wisconsin and neighboring ships. The destroyer Duncan, standing nearby, almost lost its balance from the force of this cannonade. On its deck, sailors exchanged glances. They understood that they had witnessed retribution that would go down in history. It was then that one of them broadcast a short message. Temper, temper. But everyone realized that this joke concealed both fear and deep respect for Big Wisky's fury. Within minutes, the ship spewed hundreds of tons of steel. Its 9-gun salvos were so powerful that enemy forces ceased to exist as an organized unit. Nothing remained at the battery's position. No people, no weapons, not even a hint that a military position had once been there. All of this was the result of just one hit on the Colossus, a daring act for which the North Koreans paid a price exceeding all expectations. The crew on deck stood silently. Sailors watched as plumes of smoke rose over the coast, as ruins burned, and understood this was not just retribution. It was a signal for all enemies. Touch Big Wisky, and you'll vanish. Even the bravest among the adversaries now knew that attacking this steel monster was a death sentence. That day marked a turning point. The legend of the unsinkable giant gained a new face. Now it was not only a ship capable of withstanding blows, but also one that responded so fiercely that the ground shook. Its name thundered across the front once more, and even allies confessed. When Big Wisky opened fire, they felt they were fighting alongside the god of war. It would seem that after the Korean War, the Wisconsin deserved peace. It returned to base, survived a collision with the destroyer USS Eden, where both ships lost their bows, and was even partially restored with the help of the unfinished Battleship Kentucky. But this giant, like a living creature, had no intention of fading into the shadows. Decades later, in an era when it seemed the time of battleships had long passed, Big Wisky came alive again. In the 1980s, President Reagan announced a 600-ship Navy program. The world was once again on the brink of a major war, and Washington needed symbols of power capable of shaking the enemy with their mere appearance. That's when they remembered the Wisconsin. The legend was pulled from reserves, modernized, and transformed into a new generation monster. Now its deck gleamed with new systems. Along with its 9 old but still deadly 406mm guns, the ship received Tomahawk and Harpoon missiles. The ancient Steel Thunder now combined the fire of the past with the technology of the future. Its radars could see targets for tens of kilometers, and its missiles struck the enemy with surgical precision. It was as this updated and formidable Big Wisky that it entered the last major war of its century, Operation Desert Storm. January 1991 arrived. On the horizon of the Persian Gulf, the shadow of the Colossus rose again. The Iraqi army, fortified along the coast, did not yet know what was coming. But as soon as the first tomahawks roared from the deck, they understood this was the return of a legend. Hundreds of missiles tore towards targets, command posts, depots, radars, communication nodes. Following them, the good old gun spoke. And though the Wisconsin was almost half a century old, each of its salvos still shook the earth. Shells weighing almost a ton tore apart Iraqi fortifications along the coast. Enemies tried to take cover, tried to resist, but all they could do was watch as the heavens rained down upon their heads. The night when the battleship shelled almost nonstop was particularly memorable. Salvo after salvo disappeared into the darkness, and the coast turned into a blazing wall. For the Allies, it was a signal. The legend was alive, back at war. For the enemies, a terror that robbed them of sleep. Even Iraqi officers later admitted that the sound of those guns instilled panic. Thus, in the most modern war of the late 20th century, Big Whiskey once again proved that its time had not passed. It was the last battleship on the planet to participate in a real battle. The last of the Titans, once again showing the world that steel and fire do not age. But this was its last campaign. After the Persian Gulf, it returned home, and only one role awaited it: to become a monument to an era. Big Whiskey's final shots thundered in the Persian Gulf. Battles still raged on the coasts of Kuwait and Iraq, and the battleship continued its service as if time had no power over it. At night, its salvos lit up the sky like lightning. Each shot was a reminder that even after half a century, the steel giant remained a weapon of deterrence. Its Tomahawk missiles ripped from their launchers and flew precisely to targets, striking command posts, ammunition depots, and communication nodes. And the main guns, those same 9 barrels that had passed through World War II and Korea, pounded fortifications and artillery positions with the same fury as decades ago. The Allies looked at this ship with respect and admiration. It was a living reminder of old-school power, of a time when the ocean belonged to giants of steel. Even modern generals admitted the presence of the Wisconsin had an effect comparable to the appearance of an entire fleet. It instilled fear with its mere silhouette, and its fire destroyed everything in its path. And so, when the war ended, the legendary battleship returned home. Its mission was complete. It became the last active battleship on Earth. It was the last to prove that the era of steel titans had not passed irrevocably, that they could still dictate terms and decide destinies. Its guns fell silent, its deck emptied, but the end of its service was not the end of its story. Big Whiskey was not scrapped. It became a museum in Norfolk, Virginia. Now its decks are open to all visitors. People board, touch the cold steel, look at the guns that once turned the world upside down, and feel the breath of history. Veteran sailors give tours, recounting how the battleship saved surrounded units, how it endured typhoons, how it responded to enemy strikes with such fury that the earth trembled. Today, Big Whiskey is a monument not only to American engineering, but to an entire era when fates were decided on the waves and shrapnel from giant shells rang in the sky. Its story reminds us, even the most powerful machines eventually pass on, but the legend continues to live in memory.